Eleanor Morrow had always found solace in the hushed corners of the town library. Her days spent cataloging forgotten stories and uncovering the hidden gems of literature. A middle-aged librarian with a penchant for nostalgia, she enjoyed her quiet life, one that revolved around books and the familiar faces of the library's regulars. But on a chilly autumn morning, her routine was interrupted when a peculiar donation arrived. The box was heavy, filled with old leather-bound books that bore the unmistakable musk of time. It had been sent anonymously with a brief note attached from the estate of Florence Cartwright. May these books find a good home. Florence Cartwright had been a well-known figure in town, a wealthy recluse who passed away weeks earlier, leaving behind whispers of untold riches and unresolved family drama. Eleanor was used to odd donations, but something about this one struck her as different. The books were beautiful but weathered, their covers embossed with faded gold leaf, their pages yellowed and fragile. She began her usual process of sorting and cataloging, carefully leafing through each volume to assess its condition and relevance to the library's collection. It was in the middle of this task that her hand brushed against something unusual. Inside an unassuming leather-bound book with no title, she felt a slight bulge beneath the pages. Her brow furrowed as she carefully turned to the source of the disturbance. Tucked between two pages was a folded sheet of parchment, brittle to the touch but surprisingly well preserved. She unfolded it slowly, her heart quickening as the details came into focus. It was a map intricately drawn with faded ink, depicting a version of the town that seemed both familiar and strange. Streets she recognized were accompanied by landmarks that no longer existed: an old mill, a general store, and a vast expanse of farmland where the modern suburban sprawl now stood. But what truly startled her was a name scrawled near the edge of the map in elegant cursive: Everett. Her family name. Below it, in smaller writing, were the cryptic words, "To those who seek." Eleanor's mind raced as she stared at the map, memories of her late grandmother's stories flooding back with startling clarity. Her grandmother had often spoken of the Everett family's lost legacy, a tale passed down through generations. According to the stories, her great-grandfather had been a wealthy landowner, but a series of unfortunate events, scandals, lawsuits, and betrayals had stripped the family of their fortune. Rumors persisted that he had hidden something valuable before his death, a treasure that would one day restore the Everett name. As a child, Eleanor had dismissed these stories as fanciful tales meant to entertain. But now, holding this map in her hands, she felt the weight of those legends in a way she never had before. At first, Eleanor tried to dismiss it as a coincidence. Perhaps the name Everett on the map referred to someone else, another family entirely. And yet, the handwriting stirred something deep within her, a faint but persistent sense of familiarity. Her curiosity refused to be quelled. That evening, as the library emptied and the world outside grew quiet, she spread the map out on her desk and began to examine it more closely. There was a small X marked near what appeared to be an old oak tree on the outskirts of town. That area, she realized, was now an overgrown and neglected park, a place few people ventured anymore. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eleanor's dreams were vivid, filled with fragmented images of her grandmother's face, the sound of her voice telling the old family stories, and the feeling of running through fields as a child, her imagination fueled by the tales of hidden treasures. She woke up restless, her mind consumed by the map and the possibilities it represented. It wasn't just about the treasure, if it even existed. It was about uncovering a piece of her family's history, of finally understanding the whispers that had surrounded the Everett name for so long. Over the next few days, Eleanor dove into research, trying to piece together the history of the landmarks on the map. She scoured the library's archives, poring over old photographs, property records, and handwritten accounts of the town's past. What she found only deepened the mystery. The park, it turned out, had once been part of a sprawling estate owned by her great-grandfather, a fact that had been buried under decades of urban development. She also discovered references to a bitter legal battle that had left the Everett family in ruins, though the details remained frustratingly vague. Eleanor confided in a trusted library regular, Mr. Barnes, a retired history teacher with a knack for storytelling. When she showed him the map, his eyes lit up with recognition. "This is incredible," he said, tracing the landmarks with a trembling finger. "I remember hearing stories about the Everett estate when I was a boy. They said your great-grandfather was a man of secrets, always one step ahead of his enemies. If he hid something, he did it for a reason." His words sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. But not everyone shared Mr. Barnes's enthusiasm. When Eleanor mentioned the map to her sister over the phone, she was met with skepticism. "You're chasing ghosts," her sister said, her tone dismissive. "Even if it's real, what good will it do? The past is the past, Eleanor. Leave it there." The words stung, but they also fueled Eleanor's resolve. This wasn't just about proving a family legend. It was about reclaiming a part of herself that had always felt incomplete. Finally, Eleanor made her decision. She would follow the map's trail, no matter where it led. As she packed a small bag with essentials, flashlights, gloves, and a notebook for recording her findings, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. What if the treasure wasn't what she hoped it would be? What if it unearthed truths that were better left buried? These questions lingered in her mind as she locked up the library and stepped into the crisp evening air. The map was folded in her pocket, a fragile yet powerful link to a past she was determined to uncover. Eleanor arrived at the park early the next morning, the map clutched tightly in her hand and her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The park was a shadow of its former self, a neglected patch of land overrun with weeds and wildflowers. The towering oak tree, the one marked with a mysterious X on the map, still stood tall in the center, its sprawling branches casting dappled shadows on the ground below. She couldn't help but feel a sense of reverence as she approached it, the map guiding her every step. Her breath hitched as she stood before the tree, running her fingers along its rough bark and wondering how long it had been since anyone had cared enough to visit this forgotten place. She spent the first hour circling the tree, inspecting the ground for any sign of disturbance or hidden markers. The map offered no further hints, only that the tree was significant. Frustrated but undeterred, Eleanor knelt down to inspect the base of the tree more closely. That's when she noticed something odd, a small engraving, almost entirely obscured by moss, carved into the tree's trunk. She brushed the moss aside, her fingers trembling as the faint outline of a symbol came into view. A circle with an arrow pointing upward, flanked by initials. The initials were faint, weathered by time, but unmistakable. They were her great-grandfather's, J for Jonathan Everett. The sight of those initials sent a chill down her spine. This was no coincidence. Her great-grandfather had left a mark, a clue that was meant to be found. Eleanor felt a surge of determination as she began to dig around the tree's roots, the soft earth giving way easily beneath her hands. Her fingers brushed against something solid, a small rusted tin box buried just beneath the surface. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, she pried it open to reveal its contents, an aged piece of parchment, folded neatly and covered in elegant handwriting. The note was addressed to those who seek and contained a riddle. Beneath the oak where shadows play, the first of truths begins its stay. Follow the path where rivers meet, to the place where past and present greet. Eleanor read and reread the riddle, trying to make sense of its cryptic message. Follow the path where rivers meet, she muttered to herself, her mind racing through the possibilities. The town had a small river that forked into two branches on the eastern edge of the old district, a place she vaguely remembered from childhood trips with her father. Could this be the next location? The idea both thrilled and terrified her. Her excitement was short-lived as she realized the implications of what she had just uncovered. If this was indeed the first of several clues, how far would she have to go to uncover the truth? And what if the treasure wasn't something she could keep? What if it belonged to the town, or worse, to someone else entirely? The thought weighed heavily on her as she tucked the parchment back into the tin box and carefully placed it in her bag. As she stood up, brushing dirt from her hands, Eleanor noticed something else. She wasn't alone. A man was watching her from a distance, his figure partially obscured by the overgrowth. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and stood perfectly still, as if waiting for her to notice him. Her pulse quickened, fear and suspicion rising in her chest. Who was he, and why was he here? She debated whether to approach him or pretend she hadn't seen him, but before she could decide, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without a word. The encounter left Eleanor shaken. Had someone been following her? Had they seen her uncover the map's first clue? She tried to push the thought aside as paranoia, but the man's silent presence lingered in her mind as she left the park and headed home. That night, Eleanor pored over the map and the riddle, her desk cluttered with notes and town maps she had pulled from the library's archives. The more she studied it, the more convinced she became that the next clue lay near the old river fork, a part of town that had been largely abandoned after the mills shut down decades ago. The area was quiet now, almost eerily so, and the thought of venturing there alone made her uneasy. But the alternative, giving up, was unthinkable. Her mind drifted to the man in the park. Could he be connected to the Cartwright estate, or perhaps another descendant of someone involved in her great-grandfather's story? The possibility that others might be after the same treasure added a new layer of urgency to her quest. She couldn't afford to waste time. As dawn broke the next day, Eleanor packed her bag once more, adding a small flashlight and a thermos of coffee for the long day ahead. The journey to the river fork would take her through parts of town she hadn't visited in years, places steeped in the kind of history most people preferred to forget. But Eleanor wasn't most people, and she wasn't about to let fear or the unknown stop her now. With the map tucked safely in her pocket and the riddle etched into her memory, Eleanor set off toward the next clue, her steps quickened by the sense that she was no longer just uncovering a treasure, but reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost to time. The air was crisp and still as Eleanor made her way to the outskirts of town, where the old river fork meandered through forgotten patches of land. This part of the town had once been bustling with life, home to mills and small factories that relied on the river's currents. Now it stood in stark contrast to its former glory, silent, overgrown, and abandoned. Eleanor had packed sensibly for the day. Sturdy shoes, gloves, a small spade, and her notebook where she jotted down every detail of her findings. The map was folded neatly in her jacket pocket, and the riddle from the tin box echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. The fork in the river was just as she remembered from her childhood, though time and neglect had taken their toll. The wooden footbridge that once spanned the smaller branch of the river was now collapsed, its rotting planks jutting out at odd angles. Weeds and wildflowers grew freely along the banks, and the faint scent of damp earth filled the air. Eleanor stood at the edge of the water, gazing at the point where the two branches met, trying to make sense of the riddle's cryptic lines. "Follow the path where rivers meet," she murmured. To the place where past and present greet, she scanned the area for any sign of a path, her eyes landing on a faint trail that wound its way into a cluster of trees on the far side of the fork. The trail was overgrown but discernible, as if it had been used sporadically over the years. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, the memory of the man in the park resurfacing in her mind. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see him again, but the landscape was empty, save for the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Gathering her courage, she crossed the shallower branch of the river, stepping carefully on the rocks to avoid slipping. The trail beckoned her forward, its twists and turns obscured by shadows and underbrush. As she ventured deeper, the sounds of the river faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig beneath her feet. The air grew cooler, and Eleanor felt a strange mix of excitement and unease, as though she were trespassing on sacred ground. The trail led her to a clearing, and in the center stood a stone marker, weathered and moss-covered, barely visible against the backdrop of trees. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached it, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. The marker was carved with intricate patterns, and though much of it was eroded, she could make out the faint outline of a compass rose. At its base lay another tin box, identical to the one she had found at the oak tree. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the box, revealing another parchment, this one larger and more detailed than the last. The new map depicted the same area as the original, but with additional markings, symbols, arrows, and annotations that hinted at a hidden passageway nearby. There was also another note, written in the same elegant handwriting. Here lies a piece of what was lost, a secret kept despite the cost. But those who seek must first endure the trials that test intentions pure. The words sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. The treasure wasn't just hidden. It was protected, concealed behind layers of challenges meant to deter the unworthy. She sat down on a fallen log, the weight of the discovery sinking in. What kind of trials lay ahead? And who had designed them, her great-grandfather, or someone else entirely? As she studied the new map, she noticed something peculiar, a symbol resembling a key etched near the base of the river fork. It wasn't just a marking, it was a clue. She hurried back to the water's edge, retracing her steps to the point where the two branches met. There, partially submerged in the muddy bank, was a small rusted object sticking out of the ground. Eleanor's heart raced as she knelt down, digging carefully with her gloved hands until she uncovered a key, its metal tarnished but intact. The key felt significant, though its purpose remained a mystery. Eleanor held it tightly, her mind racing with possibilities. Could it unlock a hidden chamber or a box containing the next clue? She tucked the key into her bag, resolving to figure out its purpose later. For now, she needed to follow the new map's instructions, which led her further upstream to a location marked with a star. As she prepared to leave the river fork, a sudden sound stopped her in her tracks, a branch snapping underfoot. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the tree lean, but she saw nothing. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before, and Eleanor's pulse quickened. Was it the man from the park, or someone else entirely? She called out, her voice echoing in the stillness, but no reply came. The forest was silent once more, save for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eleanor knew she couldn't let fear derail her mission. She clutched the map tightly, drawing strength from the thought of her grandmother and the stories that had guided her here. The treasure wasn't just a prize, it was a piece of her family's legacy, a chance to understand the past and perhaps reclaim some of what had been lost. With renewed determination, she followed the trail upstream, the key in her pocket feeling heavier with each step. The journey was far from over, but Eleanor knew she was getting closer. The clues were falling into place, and the promise of discovery propelled her forward. Yet, in the back of her mind, questions lingered. Who else might be searching for the treasure? And what secrets would it reveal about her family, secrets that might change everything she thought she knew? Eleanor's steps grew more purposeful as she followed the map's latest instructions upstream, her eyes scanning the surroundings for the star-marked location. The dense forest around her seemed to close in, the canopy above filtering the sunlight into a dim greenish glow. The air was damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves, and the distant babble of the river provided an eerie soundtrack to her journey. The key in her pocket felt like a talisman, its presence grounding her amidst the growing sense of mystery. She couldn't help but wonder what her great-grandfather had intended with all these clues. Had he anticipated that someone, his own blood, would one day uncover his carefully hidden trail? The new map guided her toward a rocky outcropping that jutted out over the riverbank. It was a place she vaguely remembered from childhood, though the details were hazy. Her father had once taken her on a fishing trip nearby, pointing out the natural rock formations and telling her stories about how the area used to be bustling with settlers long before the town was founded. Now, as Eleanor stood before the weathered rocks, she noticed a peculiar feature she had overlooked as a child, a narrow crevice, partially obscured by overgrown ivy, that seemed to lead into the hillside. Her breath caught as she examined the crevice more closely. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and faint markings were etched into the stone surrounding it, symbols that matched those on the map. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. This was the hidden passage the map had hinted at. The idea of venturing into the darkness unnerved her, but the promise of uncovering the next clue was too enticing to ignore. She hesitated only briefly before reaching into her bag for the flashlight she had packed that morning. The beam of light cut through the darkness as Eleanor stepped into the narrow passage, the air inside cool and musty. The walls were damp to the touch, and the floor was uneven, littered with loose stones and debris. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing softly in confined space. The passage wound deeper into the hillside, the air growing colder with each step. As she ventured further, she began to notice carvings along the walls, simple but deliberate symbols that seemed to tell a story. One carving depicted a tree with roots extending deep into the ground, while another showed a key unlocking a chest. The most striking image, however, was a compass rose surrounded by rays of light, with the word truth carved beneath it in elegant script. Eleanor paused to trace the word with her fingers, a sense of reverence washing over her. This wasn't just a treasure hunt, it was a journey of discovery, one that her great-grandfather had designed to test not just her resolve but her understanding of the family's legacy. The passage eventually opened into a small chamber, its walls lined with stone shelves that appear to have once held various objects. Most of the shelves were empty now, their contents likely lost to time, but one shelf held a single item, a small, intricately carved wooden box. Eleanor's heart raced as she approached it, her hands trembling as she lifted it from its resting place. The box was surprisingly heavy, its surface adorned with the same compass rose she had seen on the walls. She tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. Her fingers instinctively went to the key in her pocket, and with a sense of mounting anticipation, she inserted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked, and the lid creaked open, revealing a folded piece of parchment and a tarnished gold locket. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears as she picked up the locket, its surface engraved with the initials J.E. and a date, 1874. Inside was a faded photograph of a young couple, their faces radiating joy. She recognized the man immediately. It was her great-grandfather, Jonathan Everett. The woman beside him must have been her great-grandmother, a figure she had heard about only in fragments of family lore. The parchment contained another riddle, written in the same elegant hand. A bond of love, a pledge of trust. In soil untouched, you'll find what's just. Return to the tree where secrets lay, and dig where roots keep light at bay. The words stirred a wave of emotions in Eleanor. The locket was clearly a deeply personal artifact, a symbol of the love her great-grandfather had shared with his wife. But the riddle suggested there was more to be found. Perhaps the true treasure was still hidden beneath the oak tree in the park. The realization filled her with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Why had her great-grandfather gone to such lengths to bury these pieces of his past? What truth was he trying to protect, and what would it mean for her family if she uncovered it? Eleanor lingered in the chamber for a while, absorbing the weight of her discovery. The photograph, the locket, and the riddle all felt deeply significant, as if they were pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for her to solve. But she also felt a pang of guilt. Was it right to unearth these secrets, to dig into a past that her ancestors had chosen to hide? The moral dilemma gnawed at her as she placed the items back in the box and secured it in her bag. As she made her way back through the passage, the question swirled in her mind. What if the treasure wasn't material wealth, but something intangible, something that could change the way her family viewed their history? And what if uncovering it brought more pain than healing? The weight of these thoughts followed her out of the passage and back into the sunlight, where the world felt both brighter and heavier than before. The journey wasn't over. The next step was clear. She had to return to the oak tree, the place where it all began. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the only one following this trail. The thought of the man in the park, his silent presence, lingered in her mind. Was he a rival, descendant of someone else connected to this story, or simply a bystander? The uncertainty added a new layer of tension to her quest. As she stood by the riverbank, the locket still warm in her hand, Eleanor resolved to see this journey through, no matter where it led. The treasure wasn't just about reclaiming her family's legacy. It was about finding herself, understanding the past, and perhaps finding a way to heal the fractures that had lingered in her family for generations. Eleanor returned to the oak tree with a sense of resolve that was stronger than her lingering fears. The locket and the riddle had added new weight to her journey, making it feel less like a treasure hunt and more like a quest for truth. The tree stood as it had before, its ancient branches stretching skyward, a silent witness to decades of history and secrets. The autumn sun filtered through its leaves, casting long shadows across the park, and the air was filled with the faint rustling of the wind. Eleanor knelt at the base of the tree, the riddle's words echoing in her mind. Dig where roots keep light at bay. She chose a spot near the base of the largest root, a place where the dense canopy above ensured that sunlight rarely touched the ground. As she began to dig, the earthy scent of the soil filled her nostrils, grounding her amidst the flurry of thoughts racing through her mind. Each stroke of the spade felt significant, as though she were peeling back layers of time, uncovering a story that had been waiting to be told. The minutes stretched into an hour as she worked tirelessly, her gloves stained with dirt and her muscles aching. Just as doubt began to creep in, her spade struck something solid. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She cleared the dirt away with trembling hands, revealing a wooden chest, its surface worn but intact. The chest was small, no larger than a jewelry box, and bore the same compass rose she had seen on the carvings in the hidden passage. She hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. What if opening this chest changed everything she thought she knew about her family? What if it revealed truths that were painful or unsettling? The moral dilemmas she had grappled with throughout her journey came rushing back, but she knew there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, she inserted the key into the chest lock and turned it. The lid creaked open, revealing its contents, a bundle of aged letters tied together with a faded ribbon, a small leather-bound journal, and a velvet pouch. Eleanor's hands hovered over the items, unsure where to begin. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter, her breath catching as she recognized her great-grandfather's handwriting. The letter was addressed to his children, Eleanor's grandparents, and it began with an apology. "My dearest children, if you are reading this, then you have found what I hid away so many years ago. I have carried the weight of these secrets for too long, and though I cannot undo the mistakes of the past, I hope that what lies here will bring you the understanding and peace that I was never able to find." The letter went on to recount a story that Eleanor had never heard before. Her great-grandfather had been embroiled in a bitter feud with another prominent family in town, the Cartwrights. The conflict had begun over land disputes, but it escalated into accusations of theft, betrayal, and even violence. At the heart of it all was a forbidden love. Jonathan Everett had fallen in love with Florence Cartwright, the daughter of his rival. The journal detailed their secret relationship, the lengths they went to hide it, and the eventual fallout when their families discovered the truth. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she read about the pain and sacrifices her great-grandparents endured. Their love had been strong, but the pressure from their families had forced them apart. Florence had been married off to another man, and Jonathan had poured his grief into building a life for his family while hiding the evidence of their relationship. The locket, she realized, was a token of their love, and the letters and journal were his way of preserving their story for future generations. The velvet pouch contained a piece of jewelry, a gold ring with an inscription on the inside, "Forever a Finjay." Eleanor held the ring in her hand, its cool surface a tangible connection to the past. The weight of the discovery was almost too much to bear. Her great-grandfather had hidden this treasure not to preserve wealth, but to preserve a legacy of love and resilience, a story that defied societal norms and challenged the prejudices of their time. As Eleanor sat beneath the oak tree, the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. The Cartwright estate's donation had been no coincidence. It was Florence's way of ensuring that the truth would one day come to light. The man she had seen in the park, she realized, might have been a Cartwright descendant, someone who had known or suspected the story and had been watching to see if she would uncover it. But the discovery left Eleanor with more questions than answers. What should she do with this knowledge? Should she share the letters and journal with her family, or keep them hidden as her great-grandfather had intended? Would revealing the truth bring healing, or would it reopen old wounds? The moral dilemma weighed heavily on her as she packed the items carefully back into the chest. She sat for a long time beneath the oak tree, the sunlight filtering through the leaves and casting dappled patterns on the ground. Her journey had uncovered more than just a treasure. It had revealed the strength and complexity of her family's history, the love and pain that had shaped their lives. As the sun began to set, Eleanor made her way back to her car, the chest cradled in her arms. She knew that her journey wasn't over. The truth she had uncovered was powerful, but was also fragile, and the decision of what to do next would require courage and wisdom. For now, though, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her great-grandfather's legacy, the love story that had endured through time, and the hope that somehow she could honor it in the way it deserved. The drive back from the park was quiet, the rhythmic hum of the car's engine a faint backdrop to the storm of thoughts swirling in Eleanor's mind. The chest, now resting on the passenger seat, felt heavier than its modest size suggested. With every bump in the road, it seemed to remind her of the responsibility she now carried. The letters, the journal, the locket, and the ring, they weren't just artifacts. They were pieces of a story that had been deliberately hidden, waiting for the right moment, and perhaps the right person to bring them to light. Eleanor couldn't escape the question that had lingered since the moment she unearthed the chest. What was she supposed to do now? By the time she reached her modest home, dusk had settled over the town, casting long shadows across her front yard. She carried the chest inside with the utmost care, placing it on the coffee table in her living room. She lit a single lamp, its warm glow illuminating the journal and letters as she arranged them before her. Her cat, Willow, jumped onto the couch beside her, purring softly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Eleanor ran her fingers over the aged leather of the journal's cover, trying to steady herself. The decision ahead was monumental, and the weight of it pressed down on her like an invisible hand. The first step, she decided, was to understand the full scope of what she had found. She spent the entire evening reading every letter, carefully turning the fragile pages of the journal, and piecing together the timeline of events that had led to her great-grandfather's decision to bury his story. The letters between Jonathan Everett and Florence Cartwright painted a vivid picture of their forbidden romance, secret meetings by the river, coded messages exchanged through mutual friends, and whispered promises of a future together. Their love was undeniable, but so too was the pressure they faced from their families, both of whom viewed their union as a betrayal of blood and heritage. The journal, written in Jonathan's hand, revealed the heartbreak that followed their forced separation. Florence's marriage to another man had left Jonathan devastated, but he had poured his energy into building a future for his children. The feud between the Everett and Cartwright families had only deepened, resulting in years of lawsuits and financial losses that stripped the Everetts of their land and wealth. The final entries in the journal were particularly poignant. Jonathan's reflections on what he had lost, his hopes for reconciliation, and his decision to leave behind the chest as a testament to the love he and Florence had shared. Eleanor's emotions ran the gamut as she read. Sadness for the pain her ancestors had endured, admiration for their resilience, and anger at the societal constraints that had torn them apart. But most of all, she felt a deep connection to their story, as if their struggles and sacrifices had somehow shaped her own life in ways she was only beginning to understand. By the time she closed the journal, it was well past midnight, but Eleanor couldn't sleep. Her mind was too restless, torn between conflicting impulses. Part of her wanted to protect the chest and its contents, to keep them as a private reminder of the family legacy she had uncovered. But another part of her felt a growing sense of responsibility to share the story, to honor her great-grandfather's wish that the truth be known. The next morning, she decided to confide in someone she trusted. She called her younger sister, Claire, who lived in a neighboring town. Claire was skeptical at first, dismissing the story as yet another of their grandmother's exaggerated tales. But when Eleanor described the chest, the letters, and the journal in detail, Claire's tone shifted. "You're serious," she said, her voice filled with a mix of wonder and apprehension. "This changes everything. Do you think Mom knew about any of this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Their mother had passed away years earlier, taking with her a lifetime of stories and secrets. If she had known about Jonathan and Florence, she had never spoken of it. Claire suggested that they meet in person to go through the chest together, and Eleanor agreed, feeling a flicker of relief at the thought of sharing the burden. That evening, Claire arrived at Eleanor's house, her curiosity palpable. Together, they unpacked the chest, laying out its contents on the dining table. As they read through the letters and journal entries, they talked late into the night, sharing memories of their childhood and speculating about the choices their ancestors had made. Claire, who had always been more pragmatic than sentimental, surprised Eleanor by suggesting that they contact the historical society in town. "This isn't just our family story," Claire said. "It's part of the town's history. People should know what really happened between the Everetts and the Cartwrights." Eleanor wasn't sure. The idea of sharing such a deeply personal story with the world felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Would the town embrace the story as a tale of love and resilience, or would it reopen old wounds and stir up divisions that had long since faded? The moral dilemma weighed heavily on her. She knew that the story had the power to heal, but it also had the potential to cause pain. The decision became even more complicated when Eleanor received an unexpected visitor the next day. The man from the park appeared on her doorstep, his expression guarded but earnest. He introduced himself as Henry Cartwright, a descendant of Florence's family, and admitted that he had been following her progress ever since the donation of the books. "I didn't know what you would find," he said, his voice tinged with both caution and hope. "But I had to make sure it ended up in the right hands." Henry's presence added a new layer of complexity to the situation. He revealed that his family, too, had passed down stories of the feud and the forbidden romance, though the details had been vague and fragmented. The discovery of the chest, he said, was an opportunity to bring closure to both families, to reconcile the past and move forward. Eleanor listened carefully, her emotions swirling as she tried to process everything. Henry's sincerity was undeniable, and his perspective helped her see the story in a new light. This wasn't just about her family. It was about two families, two legacies, and the possibility of healing wounds that had festered for generations. As Eleanor sat with Claire and Henry that evening, the three of them discussed the best way to share the story. They debated whether to involve the local historical society, to hold a public exhibition, or to keep the discovery within the family. Ultimately, Eleanor realized that her great-grandfather's message had been clear. The truth needed to be known, not just for the sake of the past, but for the future. With a sense of purpose, Eleanor agreed to share the story, knowing that the journey ahead would be just as challenging as the one she had already undertaken. The truth beneath the tree had been unearthed, and now it was up to her to honor it in a way that brought understanding, healing, and perhaps even redemption. The decision to share the story of the Everett and Cartwright families was not one Eleanor took lightly. She spent days poring over the letters and journal, transcribing the most significant passages and organizing the timeline of events into a coherent narrative. Henry Cartwright had proven to be an invaluable ally, offering insights from his family's oral history and providing context to some of the gaps in the story. Claire, too, had stepped into the role of confidant and collaborator, helping Eleanor navigate the logistics of how best to present their findings. The three of them decided to approach the town's historical society, framing the story not as a scandal, but as a tale of forbidden love, resilience, and the shared history of their intertwined families. The historical society was intrigued, their initial skepticism giving way to excitement as Eleanor and Henry laid out the artifacts. The locket and ring, the letters, and the journal, they were more than just relics. They were windows into a forgotten chapter of the town's past. The society proposed hosting a public exhibition at the library, complete with a detailed presentation of the Everett Cartwright story. They assured Eleanor that the display would honor the memory of Jonathan and Florence while providing a broader context for the societal pressures and cultural norms of their time. As word of the exhibition spread, the town buzzed with curiosity. For years, the Everett and Cartwright families had been the subjects of whispered rumors, their feud a shadowy piece of local lore. Now, for the first time, the truth was about to be revealed. Eleanor felt a mix of pride and anxiety as the date of the unveiling approached. Would the townspeople see the story as she did, a testament to the power of love and the courage to defy convention, or would they focus on the feud and the pain it had caused? The night before the exhibition, Eleanor sat alone in the library, surrounded by the artifacts that had become so familiar to her. She felt the weight of her great-grandfather's words as she read them again. If you are reading this, then you have found what I hid away so many years ago. I hope that what lies here will bring you the understanding and peace that I was never able to find. His hope for peace resonated deeply with her, and she resolved to carry his legacy forward with as much grace as she could muster. The day of the exhibition dawned bright and clear, the crisp autumn air filled with the scent of fallen leaves. The library had been transformed into a space of quiet reverence, its main hall lined with displays that told the story of the Everett and Cartwright families. Photographs of the old mill and the river fork, copies of the letters and journal entries, and even a map of the town from the late 1800s helped set the scene. At the center of the exhibit was the chest itself, its modest size belying the profound impact of its contents. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding as the crowd began to gather. Familiar faces from the library mixed with townspeople she had never met, all drawn by the promise of uncovering the truth behind one of the town's oldest mysteries. Henry stood beside her, offering quiet support, while Claire worked behind the scenes to ensure everything went smoothly. As the room filled to capacity, Eleanor stepped forward to address the crowd. She spoke from the heart, her voice steady despite the nerves that coursed through her. She began by sharing the story of the chest discovery, recounting her journey from the moment she found the map and the donation to the day she unearthed the chest beneath the oak tree. She described the love story of Jonathan and Florence, the challenges they had faced, and the sacrifices they had made. Jonathan Everett and Florence Cartwright were two people who dared to love each other despite the forces that sought to keep them apart, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion. Their story is a reminder that love is not always simple or easy, but it is always worth fighting for. They left us this legacy not to dwell on the pain of the past, but to learn from it, to carry forward the lessons of resilience, forgiveness, and hope. The room was silent as Eleanor spoke, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. She could see the emotions on their faces. Some were moved to tears, others nodded in quiet understanding. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, the sound reverberating through the library like a heartbeat. But the evening wasn't without its challenges. As the crowd began to explore the exhibits, a woman approached Eleanor with a pointed question. "Why do they hide it?" she asked, her tone sharp. "If their love was so pure, why didn't they fight harder for it? Why didn't they tell the truth back then?" The question caught Eleanor off guard, but she answered with honesty. "I believe they did the best they could with the circumstances they were given," she said. "The world they lived in was different from ours, and the choices they faced were not simple. I think they left this story behind not as a way to justify their actions, but as a way to help us understand the complexities of their lives. It's up to us to honor their story by learning from it, not judging it." The woman seemed to consider this, her expression softening, and she nodded before walking away. It was a moment that reinforced for Eleanor the importance of sharing the story. Not everyone would see it the same way, but the dialogue it inspired was a step toward healing. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The story of Jonathan and Florence had finally been told, their voices echoing across generations to remind the town of the power of love and the courage it takes to face the truth. But even as she celebrated the success of the exhibition, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't entirely over. There were still unanswered questions, and the presence of Henry Cartwright suggested that the past might hold even more secrets waiting to be uncovered. The days following the exhibition were a whirlwind of reflection, praise, and quiet contemplation for Eleanor. The unveiling had been more successful than she had ever anticipated, sparking conversations throughout the town about love, legacy, and the burdens of history. Yet, as the applause faded and the library returned to its usual calm, Eleanor found herself haunted by the sense that her journey wasn't quite finished. There was a lingering unease, a feeling that the chest, the letters, and the exhibition were only part of the story. Her suspicions were confirmed one evening when Henry Cartwright called unexpectedly. His voice was laced with urgency as he explained that, while helping sort through his own family's records, he had found something significant, an unsigned letter written by Florence herself. The letter, written in delicate handwriting, spoke of a final truth buried deeper than either family had known. "It mentions another map," Henry said, his tone hushed. "A map she created, meant for someone who could see beyond the feud and understand what really mattered." Eleanor's heart raced. The idea of another map, another layer of secrets, seemed almost too much to fathom. She met Henry at his family's ancestral home the next day, a sprawling, time-worn estate that bore the scars of its fractured history. The letter, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve, was laid out on a mahogany table in the estate's library. Florence's words were poignant, filled with the same longing and sorrow that Jonathan's letters had conveyed. To the one who seeks with an open heart, the path to peace lies where it began, not in wealth, but in understanding. The truth shall set our families free. The letter included directions to a new location, a small chapel on the outskirts of town, where Florence had often gone to pray during her younger years. The chapel had long since fallen into disrepair, but the idea that it might hold the final piece of the puzzle filled Eleanor with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Henry offered to accompany her, and together they set out the following morning, the autumn sun casting long shadows over the countryside as they drove. The chapel was exactly as Eleanor had imagined, small, crumbling, and overtaken by vines and moss. Its stained glass windows were cracked, and the heavy wooden door creaked loudly as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and still, filled with the faint scent of aged wood and earth. At the front of the chapel stood an altar, its surface covered in dust but otherwise undisturbed. Eleanor's eyes were immediately drawn to a small box tucked beneath the altar, its edges barely visible in the dim light. With trembling hands, she pulled the box into the light. Unlike the chest beneath the oak tree, this box was simple and unadorned, its plain wood worn smooth with age. Inside, she found a folded piece of paper and a second locket, this one engraved with the initials FC and JE together. The paper unfolded to reveal a map, this time not of the town, but of the chapel itself, with a specific spot marked near the altar. Eleanor and Henry followed the map's instructions, moving a loose stone at the base of the altar to reveal a small compartment. Inside was a single letter, addressed simply to the future. Eleanor's hand shook as she opened it, and the words inside took her breath away. If you have come this far, then you have found not just the pieces of our story, but the heart of it. What lies here is not gold or riches, but truth that we hope will heal the wounds of the past. Our love was a gift, but it was also a challenge, one that we failed to meet in our time. To those who come after us, we ask only this: let our story be a lesson that love must never be silenced, that understanding must rise above pride, and that the future is built not on the ashes of old feuds, but on the hope of reconciliation. For generations, our families have been bound by conflict, but you have the power to break that chain. This is our gift to you, the chance to start anew. The letter was signed by both Jonathan Everett and Florence Cartwright, their names intertwined in a final gesture of unity. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she read, the weight of their words settling over her like a mantle. This was the true treasure, an opportunity to rewrite the narrative that had divided their families for so long. Henry was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable as he processed the revelation. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "We have to share this," he said. "Not just with our families, but with the entire town. They need to understand that the past doesn't have to define the future." Eleanor nodded, though the thought filled her with a mix of hope and fear. Would the town embrace this message, or would old resentments resurface? The risk was great, but so too was the potential for healing. Together, she and Henry decided to hold a second gathering, this time inviting members of both the Everett and Cartwright families. The gathering was held in the chapel itself, its crumbling walls echoing with the voices of the descendants of those who had once been bitter enemies. Eleanor and Henry stood side by side as they shared the final letter, their words weaving a narrative of love, loss, and redemption. The reactions were mixed. Some people were moved to tears, while others struggled to reconcile the story with their own memories and beliefs. But as the evening wore on, something remarkable began to happen. Conversations sparked between people who had never spoken before, connections formed where there had once been division, and a sense of shared purpose emerged. By the time the gathering ended, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. The legacy of Jonathan and Florence had not just been uncovered, it had been embraced, its lessons woven into the fabric of the present. As Eleanor stood outside the chapel, watching the last of the guests depart, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Her journey had begun with a simple map, but it had led her to something far greater, a truth that had the power to heal not just her family, but an entire community. The past could not be changed, but it could be understood, and in that understanding lay the seeds of a brighter future. The chapel door creaked shut, and Eleanor turned to Henry with a smile. "This isn't the end, is it?" she said softly. "No," Henry replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's just the beginning."